A common objection to the pre-tribulation rapture is that it appears to deliver the last generation of the church from tribulation and persecution. Is this charge true? Does the last generation of the church miss persecution and tribulation? Stay tuned. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, especially truth in the prophetic arena. Truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Now, today we're going to be looking at the objection that the pre-tribulation rapture is really just subtle escapism that has the church missing hardship and tribulation and persecution. They raise the question, if the pre-tribulation rapture is true, why does the last generation get to escape persecution and tribulation? And this insinuates that the pre-tribulation rapture can't possibly be true. But folks, this objection is simply rhetoric. It is not based on facts. The pre-tribulation rapture is not the final generation of the church getting the privilege of escaping the persecution and tribulation that the early church faced and that every generation of the church since then has faced. No person who honestly examines the facts can believe or teach this. This is just emotionally charged rhetoric trying to get people to decide the rapture question, whether it's pre or mid or pre-wrath or post, on the emotional level rather than the rational level. This argument hangs its weight on the fact that most Christians, or at least many of them, are myopic and can't see past their own experience in the affluence and freedom of America and other nations influenced by the benefits and blessings of the same kind of affluence and freedom. The truth is, this last generation is not getting a deliverance from persecution and tribulation. More Christians are dealing with persecution right now on this planet than there are Christians that are not dealing with persecution. In fact, more Christians have suffered persecution in the past 100 years than in any previous century in the history of the church. At this very moment, Christians are suffering imprisonment and horrible tragedies and beatings and violence in many parts of the world. They're suffering terribly in China and North Korea and Iran. And there are times when the persecutions in India are not far behind. In North Korea, Christians are starved and beaten to death in labor camps. In China, they're placed in insane asylums, and they're beaten, and they're drugged up. So folks, this generation does not escape persecution. Moreover, I would point out that we in America have not been given a free pass from tribulations and trials. Persecution is not the only form of tribulation and trial. The Bible plainly states that it's given to every believer in every generation, in every nation, to enter the kingdom through much tribulation. That's Acts 14:22. And we also read, in this world you shall have tribulation. John 16:33. If you are a believer, you are going to face tribulations and trials. And it doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter if you live in affluent America or impoverished America. It doesn't matter if you live in barely persecuted America, slightly persecuted Canada, slightly persecuted Europe, or severely persecuted Muslim nations, or severely persecuted North Korea and China and Iran. It doesn't matter where you live. God will see to it that every believer gets a sufficient dose of tribulation. In the parable of the sower, for instance, we see clearly that the trial of riches and pleasure just as quickly derails faith in the gospel as does tribulation and persecution. The trial of wealth and prosperity should not be winked at. To wink at these trials shows a lack of spiritual depth and discernment. And it is just as hard to be faithful in prosperity and peace as it is to be faithful in persecution and poverty. And the problem that we're facing is that we have 10 times more false converts when we have peace and prosperity. And moreover, peace and prosperity is just as likely to lead real believers to wood, hay, and stubble at the judgment seat of Christ as poverty and persecution is. Folks, poverty and persecution on this side and prosperity and peace on this side are just different trials. This is not a non-trial versus a trial. This is not non-tribulation versus tribulation. It's different kinds of trials. So let's put what's really going on in the world into proper perspective. And let's put the pre-tribulation rapture into proper perspective. The fact is the church has suffered nearly 2,000 years of trials, including the trial of persecution and martyrdom. And the last generation experiences the rapture, not because she gets to escape tribulation and persecution, but because the church's time of tribulation and persecution is over. She has been faithful in the time of Christ's patience, Revelation 3:10, when she was kept from being destroyed by the evil one, John 17:15, even though she was often harried by the evil one. Now the Lord is returning to his program with national Israel. Folks, the 70th week is designed for Israel's purification and restoration. The church was preserved during nearly 2,000 years of trial, tribulation, and persecution, and now the Lord is going to preserve Israel during the hour of trial, during the time of Jacob's trouble, which shall come upon the entire world. Folks, the Lord is moving on from the church to Israel, and he is going to finish what he started with national Israel. Israel is going to receive all of her Old Testament promises regarding the land and the kingdom and the temple and the throne. But she can only receive these promises through the new covenant that was promised to her in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Jeremiah. She can only receive them through the new birth that's part of the new covenant. She can only receive them through the Holy Spirit that is part of the new covenant. She can only receive them through God's justification, which is given to people through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, and this is part of the new covenant. So at the rapture, God is going to set the church program aside and return to Israel, even as at the time of the cross, he set Israel aside and turned to the church program. So in conclusion, the accusation that the pre-tribulation rapture gives the last generation a special pass from trials and tribulation is malarkey. It's rhetoric. It's not fact. So if you're struggling with this issue, get your myopic eyes off the lack of persecution in America and get some spiritual depth perception. This generation is suffering just as much tribulation and persecution as any generation in history. It's simply a matter of where you look and what kind of tribulations you are looking at. The fact is, the peace and prosperity that the churches have been enjoying in North America, in Europe, and Canada, and Australia, and even parts of South America and Africa and Asia, this peace and prosperity has done more to damage the spiritual integrity of the church than persecution ever did. On top of that, those who are purified in the crucible of prosperity and peace are just as much readied for the bridegroom as those who are purified in the crucible of poverty and persecution. Or do you think that Daniel and Esther were spiritual midgets? And how do you explain those real Christians in history who managed to escape persecution? Do they need to get resurrected at the end of this age to go through the tribulation so they can be part of the purified bride? Folks, if the fullness of every previous generation didn't have to go through real persecution, then the fullness of the last generation doesn't have to go through the real persecution of the tribulation to be a purified bride. The normal mixture of trials and tribulations that has characterized every preceding age is sufficient for the last generation. So folks, don't be led astray by spiritual sounding rhetoric. Stand in the plain, vanilla, boring truth of the living God. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.